Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian, and I am so glad that you are here. We are currently in London, so I'm joining you live from London. It is a beautiful Monday afternoon, and for the next 45 minutes, we're going to be engaged in a Intro to Hegel Philosophy live stream lecture. If you're new here, welcome to our learning community. Some background: I used to work as an academic at the University of Oxford Brookes, and during the pandemic, when the university was forced to shut down, I started hosting open access live stream lectures for my students. Back then, we were just a handful of like-minded thinkers and learners. I knew most of them personally. I'd say we were about 10, 15 people. And in the past 2 years, this community has just grown into a global community of lifelong learners like yourself. So thank you so much for being here. It brings me so much joy knowing that we're starting our week together. I see someone joining from South Africa. Hello. Yes, please do let me know where you're joining us from. It brings me great joy to know that we are connecting across the world. I see South Africa. Hello, greetings to you. And you can also join on YouTube. Hello from Belgium. I see Belgium. I see LA, Florida, Slovenia. Hello, it's wonderful to see you. Basically, these are open access, free, live stream lectures dedicated to philosophy. I would say that they're roughly graduate level learning, but if you're a complete beginner, you can also join us. Every lecture series is about 3 months long, and currently we are halfway through a lecture series titled The Cunning of Reason, about the Hegelian dialectic. If you'd like to support these classes, and I see you from Lebanon and the Netherlands and the Philippines, Louisiana, if you'd like to support these classes, please consider becoming a patron. On Patreon, you can download every lecture I've ever recorded. There are edited transcripts for every lecture, as well as my ebook, Introduction to Zizek, called The Complete Guide to Zizek, which collects the volumes 1 through 8 of my lecture series thus far. Because as longtime students will know, at the end of every lecture series, I release the text as an ebook for students online. So a huge thank you to all of the fellow philosophy students around the world. And we are going to continue the Introduction to Hegel lecture series as of right now. Now, if you're dropping in here, that's just fine. The title is The Cunning of Reason, or in German, Die List der Vernunft. And the title of this lecture is Does God Exist? Because we're going to be talking about the relationship that Hegel had to the concepts or the idea of God. But I want to start with something unrelated. I want to start with what is known as the ontological argument for the existence of God, which is also known as Anselm's argument. And Anselm was a monk who came up with what he believed to be a foolproof theorem for the existence of God, or if you will, the non-existence of God, but we'll get to that in a moment. So Anselm's ontological argument, his ontological reduction or deduction, essentially works like this. Imagine for a moment what God would look like. Some picture him as a man, other people picture him as some kind of, entity. And yet Anselm said, if you try to think of God as a concept, if you try to come up with some figurative idea or notion of God, you are bound to fail. And yet this, for Anselm, is precisely the proof, the evidence of the existence of God. Now, when you first hear that, that might sound a little bit nonsensical. If you can't think of it, then why would that prove that it exists? After all, usually we equate existence with something that can be demonstrated. For example, this apple exists because I am showing it to you on camera, or we think it exists. Perhaps it's AI generated. Anselm, however, argued that something which can be conceived of rationally, conceptualized or visualized, is therefore no longer pure. It's no longer absolute. And this means that God cannot be thought of as impure. We cannot think of a figuration or an image of God, of God's likeness. Therefore, the very fact that we cannot conceptualize God, for Anselm, would imply that God remains absolute or pure. He is not tarnished or diminished by our conceptualization of him. Therefore, for Anselm, the very fact that we cannot conceptualize or know God is precisely proof for his existence. This is also a metaphysical argument. If you've studied philosophy, then you will know that the binary equation, going back to Plato and even the sophists and the pre-Socratics, is the idea of an absolute pure form, truth, essence, versus particular existence, illusion, things in the world. And Anselm essentially argued that God therefore only existed on the level of the absolute, and that precisely because God was not made manifest in particular form, could not be thought of in his absolute nature, God therefore existed. Now, of course, this raises a particular tautology, if you will, which is that for Anselm, God's existence is now predicated upon his non-existence in the world, which is a peculiar form, a logical equation of the common Catholic argument that God exists in his absence, the presence of absence, the dialectic, if you will. Now, this is where Kant should be brought in. Kant has a well-known, somewhat infamous counterpoint to Anselm, or at least counterpoint to how Anselm's argument, his ontological argument, was popularly conceived of in Kant's time. Kant's argument against Anselm is essentially to say, existence is not a predicate. Now, what is a predicate? A predicate is something that you acquire, something that defines something. For example, I could say, I have a coat, and this coat is blue. Blue would be the predicate of the coat. However, I, having a coat, means that coat is a predicate of me. A predicate is something that you acquired, is something that characterizes something's nature, as it were. And Kant's argument was therefore damning. Kant argued, existence is not a predicate. Existence is not something that you acquire. Therefore, God can't acquire existence. And think about it logically for a moment, which is to say that if you see existence as a predicate, something which God can have, as soon as you argue that God does not have it, in other words, God does not have existence, then strictly speaking, you could still be arguing for the fact that God exists. He simply hasn't acquired existence. Hence, any argument against the existence of God would nevertheless uphold the idea of the being of God. And this was Kant's argument against Anselm, was essentially to say that if you treat existence as a predicate, as a particular feature of the deity, then essentially even if you deny the existence of the predicate, in other words, if you deny the existence of God, you nevertheless uphold him in his absolute state. Now, ironically, even though Kant makes this argument apropos Anselm's ontological proof, he repeats it in his own way in his famous or infamous Things in Themselves. Think about it. Kant's critique of pure reason is another way of reframing, this time in empirical form, Anselm's deduction or his question. Namely, what is the proof for the existence of pure form, of the absolute, of God? And for Kant, the proposition is essentially the same as for Anselm, which is to say, as soon as we conceptualize the idea of the absolute through its particular form, namely through something which can be thought of, then we've already tarnished it from within. We've already made it impure. Therefore, reason is itself the barrier to the absolute form. Hence why if we try to think it, we are therefore negating it. And Kant therefore upheld that objects contained an essence in themselves, which was irreducible to the horizons of human understanding and knowledge and reason. And so in a strange way, Kant actually upholds some proponents of Anselm's argument, except where he takes issue is with the idea or the notion of existence, which is to say that if we simply hinge the argument as to the ontological nature of pure form on the predicate of existence, then even if it doesn't exist, it nevertheless upholds the idea of the pure form. Therefore, existence is a barrier to the very thing which it appears to be evidence of. Now, let's take a step back here because I know I'm introducing a lot. Apologies for sipping water. Now, interestingly enough, this idea can also be found in Schelling. Remember, after Kant's famous Critique of Pure Reason, we essentially have three dominant responses. The first, Schelling's Naturphilosophie, which absolutizes the notion of nature, and we can get to that in a moment. Then we have Fichte's response, which is the Fichtean Ich-Philosophie, or the I philosophy, which subjectivizes absolutely, which we can get to in a moment. And then responding to both Schelling and Fichte, we have Hegel, who dialectically combines both the Schellingian approach and the Fichtean one. Now, Schelling has an interesting idea about the nature of God, which we should introduce here, which essentially contradicts the Kantian one and Anselm's ones. Schelling posits this: what if there was a God who wanted, if we can impose any kind of subjective reason, a God who wanted to be everything, a God who was all. And in this allness, this oneness, God created a trap for himself. Namely, if something is not just all, if something wants to be all, then it must, by its very definition, contain that which is not all. In other words, the very necessity of being one, of being all, creates invariably, or if you will dialectically, the notion of not one or not all. Therefore, particularity, particular existence, things in the world, are a manifest negation predicated on the very internal limit of the universal as one. In other words, to put it more dramatically, Schelling essentially argues that God contracts being in the same way that you contract an illness, that particular existence, which is therefore the negation of the all from within its own internal limit, like light and shadow, for example, is therefore something that happens to God, that God slips through his own fingers, as it were. And what's beautiful about this is that here we can actually see why, I'm making a leap here, why Hegel actually admired Aristotle so much. Because the funny thing is, people often think of Aristotle as being completely anti-Aristotle. In fact, a lot of Hegel's arguments are against Aristotelian formalism, which he then traces to Kantian formalism. And yet, the interesting thing is that Hegel actually admires certain components of Aristotle's thought. Specifically, Hegel goes as far as saying that Aristotle was the first purely speculative thinker. And for those of you studying Hegel or following this lecture series, you will know that speculative thought is for Hegel the highest form of thought. Now, when Hegel says this about Aristotle, he's specifically praising Aristotle's idea of a godly universal substance, which he characterizes as thought thinking itself. Or, another way that he puts it, is the unmoved mover. And the idea of the unmoved mover is very similar to what in Hegel would later be the tautological overlap of cause as its own effect. Something which moves, which gives animus to movement, and yet which itself does not move. Similar to the Schellingian idea of Anstoß, something which is catapulted into movement or particular existence, not by two particular entities pushing against each other, but by the internal negation immanent within the idea of a universal one itself. And yes, we are here in deep abstraction, but that you should know that by now, I think. And so Hegel admires Aristotle's idea of a thought thinking itself. In fact, as I'll try to argue at the end of this lecture, we can see within Hegel's idea of the cunning of reason precisely this very idea of thought thinking itself. And we could do a whole digression, which I'll try to do in the Q&A afterwards, on how this thought thinking itself can be found, for example, in Proust, etc. It's almost a modern idea, hence why we see within Hegel's post-metaphysical turn the very beginnings of what would later become an entire trend within modernism. But that's for the post-lecture Q&A, which I host for patrons. Little plug. And so Schelling has this notion of Anstoß, a kind of absolute notion which therefore gives rise to its own negation. Namely, it is not all that is, but it is also all that it is not. And that therefore particular finite existence is the immanent internal negation of this universal one, of this absolute. Therefore, it is no longer strictly speaking antithetical to it, but it arises from it out of necessity. And here we see how Schelling adapts and responds to Kant. On the one hand, he no longer sees particular existence, subjectivity, as an innate barrier to the absolute. He now sees it as a necessary unfolding of it. And yet he nevertheless upholds or radicalizes the Kantian notion of the absolute by suggesting a mystical Ur-Natur. He essentially absolutizes nature. He turns nature into a kind of mystical, unknown, absolute category that cannot be known. And that it is against the backdrop of nature that human beings unfold and make themselves manifest. Here we can actually see again why Hegel would admire Aristotle. If you go back to Aristotle, and Aristotle's famous definition of man as a political animal, we can already see why Schelling's argument about nature wouldn't necessarily gel with Aristotle's idea of instrumental reason. Aristotle's argument works like this, to simplify. Man finds his natural purpose, his natural form of being, precisely by being outside of nature. In other words, Aristotle essentially argues that one of the unique traits of mankind is that it is not natural for mankind to live in nature, in harmony with nature. Instead, man's particular destiny is precisely to step outside of nature and to live in communion with others, essentially to create, sorry, I realize I'm being neurotic about my hair, that man's purpose is to enter into communion with others, therefore to create a society. And nothing is less natural than living in a society, and all the mores and customs that come with it, the laws and institutions. That therefore, and here again we can see a foreshadowing of Hegel, to live in such an organized society, to live in such a state outside of nature, is therefore precisely how man achieves his natural purpose. And the flip side of this, the other side of the coin, if you will, is that instrumental reason, namely how man then uses the subjective reason to fulfill his purpose by means of building tools or creating science so as to think the world, etc., is precisely his natural calling. If you want to make a massive leap forward to Marxist critiques like Lukács' notion that nature is a historical category, we see here too Aristotle's argument that the very concept or notion of nature is a retroactive, if you will, illusion or subjective category of man in society. And to put that in like a less abstract way, think about how today, we buy expensive outdoor gear that we then only wear in the city, for example, or that people buy expensive cars that are supposed to be off-road vehicles, etc. The very idea of nature, of going back to nature, or think about the ideology of from farm to table, etc. That the very notion of something being natural and authentic is therefore a distinctly subjective, i.e. modern category that emerges only retroactively from the man who has exited nature. Hence, the very idea of return to nature mirrors the idea of the return to paradise. And as Hegel already argued, paradise only became thus once man had fallen out of it, had been banished from it. That therefore, the very idea of paradise is a retroactive, subjective viewpoint of that which emerges in its most precious nature precisely when it has been lost. However, strictly speaking, the ontological implication for Hegel is therefore that paradise was not paradise until man had left it. And in the same way, nature is therefore a historical category that is necessitated by man's departure from nature. Here again, we have Aristotle's argument, which is to say that man finds his natural purpose by means of engaging with others and creating a society, and therefore embarking upon instrumental reason, therefore fulfilling his natural purpose, and yet retroactively conceptualizing nature as that which is absolute and from which he is barred. In other words, the mute, inanimate, mystical, mysterious nature that appeals to us, that we like to reflect upon or watch nature documentaries of, is precisely what we see only through the lens of our subjective loss of the supposedly natural category. Hence why it's also deeply unnatural to go back into nature and to be living authentically, etc. And in today's world, this presents itself as one of the ideological fantasies par excellence. Comforting as it may be to go for a walk, these trails have to be cultivated, etc. Now, without wanting to go on a whole diatribe about the importance and the ideological relationship of nature to society, certainly not just within the contemporary moment, the point here is again about the metaphysical binary between the absolute, the pure form, and particular existence. Aristotle here introduces what is essentially a dialectical thought, which is that the natural, purest form of human life is therefore precisely this regressive attitude, namely to exit nature and to find oneself in societal living, what Hegel would later characterize as Sittlichkeit, or the whole social symbolic system of mores and manners, which Hegel then related to das Recht, or the law. All this is going to be related. I'm just taking it step by step. Thank you for listening thus far. I very much appreciate this. Now, all of this brings us back to Hegel's notion of the cunning of reason. One slightly more accessible way to understand Hegel is to essentially equate his idea of reason with the notion of the absolute, or, as Aristotle put it, thought thinking itself. And for Hegel, the absolute is therefore synonymous with the infinite and is synonymous with the idea of history. And what Hegel essentially does is that he brings two things together that are supposed to be completely opposed, namely the infinite and the finite, essence and appearance, history and the preordained ultimate rational form. And Hegel posits that the unfolding of history through all its accidental happenstances, things that could only ever have occurred under those particular conditions if someone pushed the button or didn't push the button, etc., that it is precisely through this contingent set of human interactions that the absolute is found. Now, the wrong way to interpret this, at least in my mind, is what we see in like the Princeton or Stanford history of philosophy or philosophical encyclopedia, which is the idea that we have a predetermined or preordained absolute pathway of history, like screenwriters essentially, who have pre-written a narrative arc, and that our very passions, which we believe to be our own agency, for example, our freedom and self-realization, are therefore secretly not our own, but that of a higher puppet master who live. Instead, as I've tried to argue throughout this lecture series, the cunning of reason for Hegel is precisely about this Aristotelian thought which thinks itself. Therefore, the highest form of thought for Hegel, the absolute, is not that man or mankind achieves full self-realization, but that in a strange dialectical sense, the absolute realizes itself through humanity's own cognition of itself. In other words, when Hegel declared that he had essentially encapsulated all that could be done in history and philosophy, that philosophy had ended with his work and that therefore history had ended with his work, he wasn't declaring the end of metaphysics. He was declaring the beginning of a new form of cognition that was to be liberated from this form of deterministic thinking. It's one of the paradoxes and ironies of the way in which Hegel is taught today as the ultimate mysticist who believed in a kind of preordained absolute spirit or Geist, when it is precisely Hegel who is trying to liberate subjective cognition and philosophy from this metaphysical tyranny, if you will. Now, what's key here, and I know I'm introducing a lot, so if you have the time and the patience, please do consider going back to the previous lectures because they all tie into each other. What's key here is the word cunning, the cunning of reason, the List der Vernunft. And to rephrase, Hegel essentially has two types of knowledge that he juxtaposes. He has Verstand and Vernunft. Verstand is knowledge in the world. Verstand is a predicate, if you will. Verstand is something that you can acquire. You can acquire knowledge about how things work, like how the internet works or where mineral water comes from, etc. This is knowledge that you can empirically acquire in the world. Call it a skill. And therefore, this form of knowledge is a predicate. You can have knowledge of something. You can know its features. If you go back to the Aristotelian idea of instrumental reason, this is one side of the coin, namely to know what exists in the world. Hence why Aristotle is the founding father, if you will, of what we today would call modern science. That the observation of the world and the acquisition of knowledge about it is therefore one aspect of the instrument of reason. Namely, that you acquire Verstand. And Verstand is a predicate. You can know particular features of the world, and you can acquire knowledge as a predicate of yourself. However, for Hegel, this is always a lower form of knowledge. Not lower because it's bad in any kind of normative sense, but lower because it is about the particular entities in the world. In other words, you are knowing not the absolute, you are knowing the particulars, which are the manifestations of the internal limit, the negations, the immanent negations, or self-relating negativity, if you will, of what exists in the world. Now, Hegel juxtaposes this with the idea of Vernunft, or higher reason, namely not knowledge of particular things in the world, but a higher knowledge of the absolute. However, this is where most people misunderstand Hegel, or perhaps many people misunderstand Hegel. Which is to say, Hegel is not creating a normative ladder by which you have to discard empirical reality, lower truths, in order to ascertain the higher abstract mystical truths, which would be bizarre, it would be distinctly anti-Hegelian. Instead, what Hegel is discarding is the very formalism that would imply that there is such a thing as a lower, debased knowledge, Verstand, versus a higher, enlightened Vernunft. Instead, Vernunft, the higher knowledge, is precisely the lower knowledge which knows itself, thought thinking itself. But here's, of course, where Hegel's a dialectician. It is not simply that you think thought itself, but thought is thinking itself through you. And that is what is for Hegel the cunning of reason. If reason is the sublated higher, to use this limited word, higher sense of knowledge of the universal, then it can only occur through the very fall into subjective reason. And that therefore subjective reason, particular knowledge, Verstand, of things in the world, is how the higher form is made manifest from within. Therefore, we are back at what I've often repeated to be the Hegelian ontological proposition, which is, it is the fall which retroactively generates the very thing from which it was falling. What Zizek has famously characterized as less than nothing. And now if we go back to the metaphysical proposition that we started this class with, namely how particular existence is therefore an immanent negation from the allness or the oneness of the universal or of God, you can now realize that it is not a binary between two things that are equal. It's not we have all versus not all, because they can't be compared. The not all is the immanent unfolding of the very immanent negation that exists only in the universal positing of a one, of an allness. And therefore, rather than being antithetical to it, it is entirely necessary. It reveals the truth of the universal. Therefore, the universal succumbs or falls into its particular negation and therefore realizes itself. But the key ontological proposition here is that the universal therefore does not exist a priori. It doesn't exist an sich. It only exists through this fall into matter, into subjective reason. Hence, why for Hegel, it's not that you start with Vernunft, higher absolute knowledge, and you regress or digress into particular knowledge of things in the world, in other words, Verstand. It's that, ironically, as I've said many times before, the owl of Minerva only takes flight of dusk, which is a poetic expression of Hegel's ontology, which is that the absolute form of knowledge, Vernunft, only emerges precisely through the fall into the very thing which was supposed to be antithetical to it. In other words, there is no absolute a priori. The only absolute is therefore the absolutization of the immanent negation, which is therefore productive or constitutive of the very universal itself. I know, hugely abstract, but really necessary if you want to start understanding the Hegelian dialectic. Hence, what therefore happens is that we're back at Kant's argument about existence not being a predicate. Hegel's response to Kant is therefore precisely that existence is a predicate, that the universal not only acquires or contracts existence, but that it doesn't exist before this contraction into existence. That existence is therefore this immanent contradiction, this internal contraction, what Schelling calls an indivisible remainder, through which the universal posits itself or presupposes its own suppositions. And this is a radically new ontology. This is no longer Anselm's ontology that God exists because you can't think of him, or Kant's argument that things exist in themselves because they can't be accessed by reason. Reason is no longer the barrier to cognition of the absolute. Reason is no longer the enemy of the truth outside of Plato's cave. Now reason, subjective knowing, becomes the very pathway, the very gateway to the unfolding of the absolute. Hence why it's completely nonsensical to posit that Hegel is a mysticist who believes in a kind of absolute that exists outside of human cognition. The point is precisely the absolute exists only through the fall into this human cognition. Similarly to how I said how paradise acquires the particular characteristics of paradise only by means of the fall. Something is only precious once we have lost it. In the same way, for Hegel, the universal is made manifest through its loss. But for Hegel, and this is the beautiful Hegelian piece that will drive a lot of people crazy, this thing never existed in the first place. This universal. It exists only in the fall, only in this contraction, only in this immanent negation, only in this self-relating negativity of which the subject is therefore the particular manifestation through which the universal is written, through which the infinite is realized, through which higher universal knowing is realized. And therefore, reason, Vernunft, is not something that you acquire by means of a particular progression. It's not I start with Verstand and I learn all the predicates, the particulars of existence and things in the world. And once I have learned everything, I will somehow have reached this highest form of knowing where everything becomes known to me and I become a mystic. Instead, for Hegel, it is precisely the truth of this dialectical intertwinement that constitutes universal truth or knowing. In other words, paradoxically, to understand Hegel's system is therefore to have acquired higher reason, Vernunft. And this is also the Hegel's joke, which is that no one understood me, and even the person who thought they understood me didn't understand me. It's not that Hegel is saying my work is so brilliant and difficult that no one can understand it. It's that the very idea or notion of downloading or summarizing Hegel's logic as something that can be put into bullet points that you can understand and then teach to others is antithetical to the very principle of his argument, which is his ontological proposition. Hence also why Hegel is the philosopher who is the most anti-wisdom. Hegel doesn't believe in the idea of a simplified reduction by which you can know the higher thing. And it's almost a figuration of his ontological argument. In the same way that he doesn't believe that you can acquire particular knowledge so as to know the higher form, he also doesn't believe that you can acquire more and more bits of philosophy until you've seen through the entire thing. Instead, as I argued last week, it is Marx who realizes the truth of Hegel, which is that the truth is not the truth of the thing in its content. It's not the truth inherent to the commodity. Instead, it's the truth inherent to the form. Hence, Hegel embarks on a metaphysical ontological argument that emphasizes the content in the form and not the content of the form. In other words, if you go back to the metaphysical proposition, which creates a binary between the absolute pure form and the particular illusions in the world, and says we have to discard the illusions and therefore discard the barrier of human reason to access the pure form in its absolute substance, Hegel argues you're focusing too much on content. You're focusing on the content of the absolute form, which therefore immanently becomes its own barrier. Instead, you have to focus on the hidden content in the form itself. In other words, the dialectic between the absolute and the particular contains the truth of the absolute itself. And that is it. That is the Hegelian ontological argument. It's to say, don't focus on content versus form, which is just a modern way of saying absolute versus particular. Don't focus on discarding the particular so that you can look through it and see the absolute behind it. Instead, focus on the truth that lies within the form of the interrelationship of the absolute and the particular form itself. And this truth is higher knowledge, or the dialectical unfolding of reason. Hence why for Hegel, the idea of the cunning of reason, the List der Vernunft, is not that of a puppet master who is using human passions so as to engineer a plan of his own choosing, but precisely how it is only through these passions. It is only by viewing something the wrong way that we can see it in the right way, to paraphrase Kafka, or to paraphrase Giacometti, that we have gone too far but not far enough. And that therefore the post-metaphysical turn which Hegel initiates liberates us from both Schelling's absolutization of the natural Ur-substance, which forms the background of all human activity and passions, but it also liberates us from the Fichtean idealization and absolutization of subjective reason, by which all the emphasis is placed on the subject. Instead, Hegel says, stop focusing on the content of the subject and the content of the absolute form. Focus instead on the hidden content that lies within the form itself. And this, for Hegel, is the cunning of reason. It presents itself as a binary between the absolute and the particular. And once we see through that binary, we can understand the dialectical unfolding by which the truth lies within the form itself, the interrelationship, the dialectical relationship between absolute pure form and subjective reason. And that therefore we have realized the Aristotelian proposition, which is thought thinking itself. And think about it, it's so simple if you think about it in these terms. What is the inquiry into the content that lies hidden in the form of thought? What is it if not thought thinking itself? Thought thinking itself is simply not to focus on the content of something, but to focus on the form and the interrelationship of forms that it takes. And so the Hegelian dialectic, the cunning of reason, might also be referred to as thought thinking itself. And that therefore, Vernunft, higher reason, is thought which does not think things in the world, but thought which thinks itself. That is Hegel's dialectic. That is the Hegelian cunning of reason. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I know that was a lot, but I hope that has been fruitful. Please do consider going back and watching some of the previous lectures if you want to see how this ties in with other Hegelian concepts. This is going to be a 3-month lecture series. We're already halfway through, focusing on the Hegelian cunning of reason. It's meant to be an introductory lecture, but it's also meant for more advanced students. If you'd like to download all the accompanying materials, including my complete guide to Zizek, as well as all of my lectures that I've recorded over the past 2.5 years, please do consider becoming a patron. As a patron, you can access a live Q&A, which I also post as a podcast for patrons after every lecture, which I'll be hosting in a couple minutes, as well as a whole bunch of other perks and my ebook. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I really do hope that I can see you again next week. Until then, have a wonderful week and happy learning. See you then. All right, thank you guys. This is my London apartment. I hope that you enjoy it. The camera didn't fall today, so that already seems like a win. I will see you next week.